Elara Wynn never imagined that the woman who raised her, the woman who tucked her in at night and called her my everything, would one day be the reason the man she loved vanished without a trace. That chilling truth unraveled piece by piece in the quiet town of Maple Hollow, where behind warm smiles and homemade pies, Marilyn Wynn hid a secret so dark it would shatter her daughter's world and prove that sometimes the deadliest kind of love comes from family. Asterisk, in the quiet suburban town of Maple Hollow, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets traveled slower than the wind. Elara Wynn lived a seemingly perfect life. At 24, she was the kind of young woman people described as graceful and kind. The type who helped her elderly neighbors carry groceries and painted murals for the local library. She lived in a charming 2-story house on Willow Street with her mother, Marilyn Wynn, a woman admired for her poise and warmth. Together, they looked like the picture of domestic harmony, a mother and daughter, inseparable since tragedy had taken Elara's father. Raymond, nearly a decade earlier, Marilyn had raised Elara on her own, working long hours as a nurse, while encouraging her daughter to follow her passion for art. Their home was filled with paintings, Lara's soft, emotional brushstrokes, hanging alongside framed photos of her childhood. To anyone who visited, it felt like a house built on love and quiet resilience. But beneath that peaceful exterior was a subtle tension, something invisible but heavy. Like a shadow that never left the room, Elara's life took a new turn when she met Caleb Shore. He wasn't from Maple Hollow originally. He had moved there 3 years earlier to open a small woodworking studio by the edge of town. Caleb was calm, thoughtful, and had a gentle way of speaking that made people trust him instantly. His hands were always rough from work, yet his eyes carried a softness that reminded Elara of sunlight after rain. He admired her art, and she admired his patience. Within months, their friendship grew into something more. Something that made Elara feel like her life was finally moving forward. Marilyn, however, didn't see it that way. She was polite when Caleb came over for dinner, always smiling, always offering him pie or coffee. But her eyes told a different story. They lingered too long, sharp and measuring. At first, Elara dismissed it as maternal protectiveness. After all, Marilyn had lost a husband and feared losing her daughter's attention too. But soon, Marilyn's disapproval became harder to ignore. She began questioning everything about Caleb: where he worked, who his friends were, why he hadn't gone to college. She said he wasn't good enough, that men like him always left when things got difficult. When Elara tried to defend him, Marilyn would grow quiet, her expression distant, and whispered that she just wanted her daughter to be safe. Still, Elara continued to see Caleb, often sneaking out to meet him at the lakeside or at his workshop after work. They talked about dreams, moving to the city, opening a small art gallery together, maybe even building a life far from Maple Hollow. For the first time in years, Elara felt a sense of independence. Caleb made her feel like more than a daughter trapped under her mother's careful watch. But Marilyn's behavior changed in unsettling ways. She began waiting up late at night, sitting silently in the living room with the lights off, pretending to read. Sometimes Elara would wake up to find her mother standing in her doorway, watching her sleep, claiming she had heard noises. There were small invasions, her phone misplaced, her messages opened. Caleb's number mysteriously deleted once. One morning, Elara found her bedroom window open and her sketchbook missing. She later found it in the kitchen, pages torn where she had drawn Caleb's face. When she confronted Marilyn, her mother simply said she must have misplaced it. Her calm tone made Elara doubt her own memory. Then came Marilyn's sudden illness. Just as Elara began planning to move into Caleb's small apartment, Marilyn fainted at work and was rushed to the hospital. The doctors said it was exhaustion, nothing serious, but Marilyn acted frail, insisting she couldn't be left alone. Elara put her plans on hold to care for her, and Caleb understood, visiting when he could. But every time he arrived, Marilyn seemed to worsen, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. When he left, she appeared stronger again. Elara began feeling trapped, torn between love and duty. The guilt consumed her. She couldn't abandon her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. Yet she couldn't ignore the quiet hostility that seeped into their home whenever Caleb's name was mentioned. Marilyn started calling him a distraction, saying he was pulling Elara away from her family, away from the person she was meant to be. The tension grew unbearable. Elara noticed her mother's smiles fading, placed by a strange calmness, one that didn't feel like peace, but like waiting. Waiting for something inevitable. Caleb tried to reassure Elara, telling her they would find a way to make it work. But there was a heaviness neither of them could shake. On the evening before Caleb disappeared, Marilyn made dinner for all three of them. She was unusually cheerful, humming softly as she set the table. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the kitchen. Elara remembered thinking that maybe things were finally turning around, that her mother was learning to accept Caleb after all. But when she looked into Marilyn's eyes across the table, there was something there she couldn't name. A stillness too controlled, too deliberate, like someone rehearsing calmness for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. Later that night, as Elara drifted to sleep, she heard her mother's voice faintly through the walls, soft, almost like a prayer. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone chilled her. It wasn't love she heard in Marilyn's voice that night. It was something else entirely. Something Elara wouldn't understand until it was far too late. It was the kind of rain that made everything seem quieter than usual. It's the kind that soaked through the ground and left the air heavy. That Friday evening, Elara waited for Caleb to arrive. He was supposed to pick her up at 7 for dinner at their favorite diner near the edge of town. She wore the blue dress he liked, the one he said made her look like summer. But as the hours passed, the clock ticked past 8, then 9, and still, there was no sign of him. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his social media remained silent. At first, she thought his car might have broken down. The longer she waited, the more unease crept in. Marilyn suggested calmly that maybe he had simply changed his mind, or had something come up. She brewed tea, sat beside her daughter, and told her not to overreact. Her tone was gentle. But there was something off about her expression, something almost satisfied in the corners of her smile. Elara brushed the thought aside. She barely slept that night, staring at her phone until dawn. The next morning. She called the police to report Caleb missing. They listened, took notes, and promised to investigate, though their tone carried the indifference of people used to hearing about young men who needed space. But that afternoon, everything changed. A jogger found Caleb's truck abandoned near the riverbank that bordered the forest outside town. The driver's door was open, keys still dangling from the ignition. One of his boots lay in the mud a few feet away. When Elara arrived at the scene, the air was thick with tension. Police tape fluttered in the wind as officers searched the woods. Reporters stood by the road, whispering about what might have happened. Elara could barely breathe. She saw the faint trail of footprints leading from the car toward the water, then fading into the forest floor. They looked messy, uneven, like someone had been running or struggling. The police began treating it as a missing persons case. They said it could have been an accident or even a voluntary disappearance. The theory was that Caleb might have slipped into the river, but when divers searched, they found nothing. Days later, they found his phone, smashed near a cluster of rocks, the screen shattered beyond repair. There was no message, no clue. Marilyn stayed surprisingly composed through it all. While Elara broke down, her mother prepared her meals, kept the house spotless, and told her to let the police handle it. She seemed to have accepted Caleb's disappearance as an unfortunate tragedy. She comforted her daughter, yet her words always had an odd undertone, soft but final, as if she didn't believe Caleb would ever return. Something about her calmness unsettled Elara. One afternoon, while cleaning, she noticed Marilyn had packed away all of Caleb's belongings from the house the sketch Elara had drawn of him. The mug he used for coffee, the small wooden frame he had made for her. When asked where the things were, Marilyn simply said she'd thrown them out because it was time to move on. Elara's heart sank. Caleb had been missing for only a week, and already, her mother was erasing every trace of him. As the days turned into weeks, Elara's grief twisted into obsession. She joined search groups, posted flyers, and spoke to anyone who might have seen him that night. But every lead went nowhere. The town began to move on. She couldn't. She noticed details others ignored: mud on her mother's boots despite her not leaving the house, a faint smell of smoke on her clothes, and once, a silver ring that unmistakably belonged to Caleb appearing in the laundry basket. Asterisk. Marilyn always had an explanation. The mud was from gardening, the smoke from burning old papers. The ring must have been misplaced by Caleb himself. The explanations sounded reasonable, yet they never felt right. Elara started to notice how her mother's eyes seemed to watch her constantly, studying her reactions. One evening, Elara took a walk to clear her head. When she passed by the backyard, she saw the garden lights flickering faintly. Near the back fence, something caught her eye: a torn piece of fabric snagged on the wire. It was blue with thin white stripes, identical to the shirt Caleb wore the night he vanished. Her pulse quickened. She picked it up, her hand shaking, and slipped it into her pocket before her mother noticed. That night, Elara lay awake, turning the fabric over and over in her hands. She couldn't understand what it was doing there. Caleb had never gone into the backyard that she knew of. The thought came quietly but refused to leave. What if Caleb had come to the house that night? What if Marilyn had seen him? The next morning, Marilyn made pancakes, humming cheerfully as if nothing were wrong. She asked Elara to stop obsessing, saying it was unhealthy to dwell on someone who didn't want to be found. The words struck her like ice. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Like someone who already knew the ending. As autumn began to settle over Maple Hollow, the town stopped talking about Caleb Shore. The posters faded. The searches ended, and the police closed the case as missing. Presumed dead. But Elara couldn't let go. She began writing everything down: the fabric, the ring, the mud, the strange calmness in her mother's voice. The more she wrote, the more she began to see a pattern, one that terrified her. Late one evening, Elara walked past her mother's bedroom door and heard her softly murmuring in her sleep. The words were faint but clear enough to freeze her in place. Marilyn was whispering Caleb's name, over and over, like a secret she couldn't stop repeating. Elara stood there for a long time, her heart pounding, and realized that something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she was afraid not of losing her mother, but of discovering what her mother had done. Months passed, and the chill of winter began to fade into the damp quiet of early spring. Maple Hollow seemed to have moved on, as small towns often did. People stopped mentioning Caleb's name. The flyers came down, and the police shifted their attention to other cases. Only Elara remained caught in the web of uncertainty, unable to forget the small gnawing details that refused to make sense. Her mother tried to keep things normal, cooking elaborate breakfasts, organizing the garden, and talking about how they should start fresh, but every act of kindness from Marilyn felt deliberate, like something meant to distract. Then one morning, Marilyn announced she wanted to sell the house. She said it was too full of sad memories, that they needed a new beginning somewhere else. Elara hesitated. The house had always been her anchor, her father's legacy, her studio, her entire childhood in one place. The thought of leaving made her uneasy, yet Marilyn was insistent, saying that change was the only way to heal. As Elara began packing, she noticed how her mother carefully avoided certain rooms, especially the attic. Whenever Elara mentioned cleaning it, Marilyn's expression hardened. She would quickly change the subject, claiming she'd already handled everything up there. That avoidance alone was enough to spark Elara's curiosity. One afternoon, while Marilyn was out running errands, Elara decided to go into the attic herself. The air was thick with dust, and the light bulb flickered weakly as she pulled the cord. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, labeled with dates and names in her mother's precise handwriting. Old family photos, winter clothes, decorations, all carefully arranged. But in the far corner, half hidden under a moth-eaten blanket, was a large trunk she had never seen before. The trunk was heavy, old, and covered in scratches. Its metal latch was slightly rusted, but it opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, beneath old quilts and photo albums, she found something wrapped in a stained canvas bag. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing a small collection of personal items that made her blood run cold. Caleb's wallet, the silver watch he'd worn every day, and a folded letter with her name on it. At first, She thought it might have been something Caleb left behind. But the handwriting on the letter was unmistakably her mother's. The paper was creased, smudged, and unfinished. It read, "He was going to take you away from me. I had no choice." The words blurred before her eyes. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she stared at the page, unable to comprehend what she was reading. For a long time, she didn't move. Every sound in the attic, the ticking of pipes, the faint rustle of wind outside seemed amplified. When she finally came back to herself, she quickly wrapped everything back into the canvas, shoved it deep into the trunk, and closed it. Her mind was spinning too fast for a reason. Asterisk for the next few days, Elara pretended everything was normal. She smiled when Marilyn spoke, helped her cook, even laughed when her mother joked. But inside, she was unraveling. Every glance, every word from Marilyn seemed tainted with hidden meaning. She noticed the way her mother's eyes would sometimes linger on her, as if reading her thoughts. It terrified her. She decided she needed more proof before doing anything. Late one night, she slipped outside into the cold air with a flashlight and searched around the shed where Marilyn often spent time gardening. The soil was freshly turned, damp and dark, even though Marilyn hadn't planted anything recently. Something about it didn't feel right. Elara dug through it, her fingers sinking into the earth until they hit something hard, a half-burned zipper. The metal teeth twisted in what looked like charred fabric. She pulled it out with shaking hands. It smelled faintly of smoke. She didn't sleep that night. The memories of her mother burning old papers came flooding back, the smell of smoke that she'd once dismissed as nothing. She sat at her desk until sunrise, staring at the burned zipper laid out on a napkin. The thought she had been running from began to solidify. A few days later, while helping to clean the basement, Elara opened the freezer in the corner, one her mother claimed she used for meat storage. She noticed how the top layer looked untouched frozen vegetables. Wrapped cuts of meat, but something about the way the bags were stacked seemed off. Beneath the top layer was a thick black plastic bag. It was heavier than it should have been. She didn't open it, couldn't bring herself to, but as she touched it, her hands went cold. She knew something inside her house was terribly wrong. From that moment on, everything her mother did seemed like an act. Marilyn's smile, her calm voice, the way she hummed while cooking it, all felt like a mask covering something monstrous. Elara avoided being alone with her whenever possible. She started locking her bedroom door at night, moving quietly, watching every step her mother took. The guilt of suspicion gnawed at her. Part of her still wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe she was misinterpreting everything out of grief. But when she looked at the letter, the burned fabric, and the way Marilyn's eyes sometimes glimmered with a strange, cold certainty, she couldn't deny what her instincts were screaming anymore. Elara knew she couldn't go to the police without undeniable proof. She needed something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. She began to plan carefully, waiting for the right moment to uncover the truth. Because deep down, she no longer wondered if her mother had done something to Caleb. She only wondered how. Elara could barely recognize her life anymore. The house that had once felt warm and safe now pulsed with a quiet dread. Every corner seemed to hide secrets. Every sound made her flinch. She moved through her days pretending to be the same obedient daughter she had always been. But inside, her thoughts never stopped racing. The letter, the burned zipper, the hidden bag in the freezer, they replayed in her mind over and over, like fragments of a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She started noticing more details now. Things that once seemed too small to matter. Marilyn's hands trembled slightly when she cooked, not from age, but from something deeper. Sometimes she caught her mother staring out the kitchen window for long stretches, murmuring softly to herself. When Elara asked what she was saying, Marilyn always smiled and said she was talking to her late husband. The explanation might have sounded innocent to anyone else, but to Elara, it sent chills down her spine. One afternoon, while Marilyn was in the garden, Elara decided to search her mother's room. She moved carefully, knowing Marilyn had a habit of noticing even the smallest disturbances. Inside the top drawer of her dresser, beneath folded scarves, she found an envelope with Elara's name written in faint pencil. Her stomach knotted as she opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of Caleb standing beside the back fence, smiling awkwardly as if caught off guard. The date scribbled on the back was the same day he disappeared. Elara's heart pounded. Why would her mother have that photo? Why had she hidden it? The realization that Marilyn might have taken it herself made her throat tighten. She tucked the photo into her pocket and quietly backed out of the room before her mother returned. That night, she sat on her bed, staring at the items she'd gathered. The letter, the burned fabric, the photo. Each one pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. She thought about confronting Marilyn, demanding the truth, but every time she imagined it, fear stopped her. What if her mother denied everything? Worse, what if she didn't? Instead, Elara decided to find proof no one could ignore. She bought a small voice recorder and hid it behind a jar on the kitchen shelf. Every morning before her mother woke up, she checked to make sure it was still working. For days it recorded nothing unusual, just the sounds of cooking, the hum of the refrigerator, and Marilyn's soft humming as she moved through the house. But on the fifth night, when Elara played back the recording, everything changed. The first part was normal, the faint clinking of dishes, the squeak of the faucet. Then came Marilyn's voice, low and shaky, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. The words were soft, almost tender. She said he wouldn't stop talking. He kept saying he'd take her away from me. I told him to leave. He didn't listen. I had to stop him. It's better this way. Elara froze. Her entire body went numb as the words echoed through the tiny speaker. Her mother wasn't talking about a dream or a fear she was confessing. It was calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly sincere. She replayed the audio over and over until she couldn't bear to hear it again. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped the recorder. She wanted to scream, to cry, to confront her mother right then, but she didn't. She knew she needed to act carefully. One wrong move, and Marilyn might realize what she knew. The next morning, Elara didn't say a word. She went through her routine as usual, her voice steady, her smile hollow. Inside, she felt detached, as if she were watching herself from far away. She slipped out later that day and drove to the local police station. She couldn't bring herself to file a report under her name. It was too dangerous. Instead, she anonymously mailed the evidence, the recording, a copy of the letter, and the photo. Then she waited. 2 days later, the police arrived at the Wynn residence with a search warrant. Elara stood by the window, heart pounding, as officers moved through the house. Marilyn tried to act surprised, demanding to know what was going on. But her calm faltered when they opened the basement freezer. The moment the officer lifted the black plastic bag into view, time seemed to stop. Inside were human remains later confirmed to be Caleb Shore. The air in the room turned to ice. Marilyn didn't cry, didn't shout. She simply lowered her head and whispered something no one could quite hear. When the officers placed her in handcuffs, she didn't resist. Her eyes found Elara's for a fleeting second, and what Elara saw in them wasn't guilt or fear, was pity. As Marilyn was led away, neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief. The woman everyone had admired, the nurse who volunteered at local charities, had hidden a body in her own home. Reporters arrived within hours, their cameras flashing, asking questions Elara couldn't answer. That night, as she sat alone in the now silent house, Elara played the recording one last time. Her mother's voice filled the empty kitchen, calm and loving, speaking of murder as though it were an act of devotion. The sound hollowed her out. She turned it off, but the words kept echoing in her mind. It was over, but the peace she thought she'd feel never came. Instead, there was only a cold understanding that her mother hadn't killed out of rage or hatred, but something far worse. She had done it out of love. The trial of Marilyn Wynn became the darkest story Maple Hollow had ever seen. The small courthouse overflowed with reporters and townspeople who could not believe that the quiet, smiling nurse who had attended community events and baked pies for neighbors was now accused of killing her daughter's boyfriend. The evidence was irrefutable. The letter found in the attic, the audio recording, and the remains discovered in the freezer painted a picture that no one could look away from. Yet, through it all, Marilyn sat in silence, her expression serene. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were attending church instead of her own murder trial. Elara attended every session, sitting near the back, unable to bring herself to look at her mother directly. Each testimony cut through her like glass. The detective described the condition of the remains. The prosecutor read out the letter she had found in the attic, and the forensic expert explained that the watch and wallet recovered had Caleb's fingerprints on them. Every detail confirmed what Elara already knew but didn't want to believe. Her mother had done it, and she had done it with calm precision. When Marilyn finally spoke, her voice was as steady as it had always been. She didn't deny the crime. She didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. She simply said that she had done what she thought was necessary. She told the court that Caleb had been manipulating Elara, that he wanted to take her away and leave Marilyn to grow old and alone. A mother's love is supposed to protect, she said softly, and that's what I did. I protected her. Her words chilled the courtroom into silence. There was no rage or madness in her tone, just an unsettling certainty that made her sound more dangerous than any confession ever could. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Elara Wynn was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict didn't bring relief to Elara. When the judge read it, she felt hollow, like she was floating outside her own body. Watching her mother being led away in handcuffs was like watching the last piece of her life crumble. Marilyn turned her head once, catching her daughter's eye as she was escorted out. There was no anger in her gaze, only that same calm pity Elara had seen the day of her arrest. It was the look of someone who still believed she had done the right thing. After the trial, Elara sold the house on Willow Street. She couldn't bear to step into the kitchen or look at the freezer where Caleb had been hidden. Every room carried echoes of lies disguised as love. She packed her art supplies and what few belongings she could stomach keeping and moved to a small apartment 2 towns away. She thought leaving Maple Hollow would help her forget. But memories have a way of following you, especially the ones you try hardest to escape. At night she dreamed of her mother's voice. It was never angry, never cruel, just soft and soothing. Whispering the same words again and again, "It's better this way." Sometimes she would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she could smell the faint scent of her mother's perfume in the room. She tried to fill her days with painting, but even her art began to change. The colors darkened, the shapes twisted. Without meaning to, she started painting her mother's eyes, sharp, watchful, and hauntingly calm. Reporters reached out often asking for interviews. They wanted her to tell her side of the story, to give the world insight into what it was like to be the daughter of a murderer. For months, she refused, not wanting to relive it all. But eventually, she agreed to one televised interview. Sitting under bright studio lights, she spoke quietly, her hands folded just like her mother's had been in court. She said she didn't hate Marilyn. She couldn't. Hate would have meant she still felt something powerful enough to burn. What she felt instead was emptiness, a kind of sadness that never faded. When asked if she ever forgave her mother, she paused for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness isn't the right word," she said finally. "Understanding is? I understand her now, and that's worse. She loved me in her own way, but her love was poisoned. It was never about what I wanted. It was about keeping me hers. I think in her mind, she really believed she saved me." After that interview, Elara stopped speaking publicly. She rarely returned to Maple Hollow. The old house was eventually torn down by the new owners, but sometimes she still drove past the empty lot. She would sit there for a few minutes, staring at where her bedroom window used to be, remembering the nights she thought her mother was just overprotective, never realizing she was watching her every move. Years went by. But the story of Elara Wynn never disappeared. It turned into a local legend, a whispered warning about how love can twist into something monstrous when it's built on control. Elara tried to move forward, but she carried the weight of that story in her silence. In every painting, in every sleepless night, she knew she would never escape the truth, completely, because it lived inside her, the reflection of a woman who had destroyed everything in the name of love. The tragedy of Elara Wynn wasn't just that she killed Caleb Shore. It was that she truly believed she had done it out of devotion, that in her mind, The murder was an act of care, not cruelty. That realization was what haunted Elara most. It taught her that the scariest kind of evil doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it wears a gentle smile, speaks softly, and calls itself love.